Montana Territory, August 1879. The wind carried the scent of dust and pine through the open valley as Hayden Lark rode south along the wagon trail. Boots worn, hat low, and heart quieter than it used to be. The sun was just past its highest point, casting shadows across the ruts in the road when he spotted her. A woman in a white dress, sitting on a broken trunk at the edge of the crossroads like she had nowhere else left to go. Hayden slowed his mare, his gaze narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. She looked like she had stepped out of a wedding chapel and into a storm. Her skirt was torn at the hem, veil tangled in her hair, dust on her fingers where they gripped the cracked leather handle of the trunk. Her eyes were wide and dry, like she had finished crying hours ago and now had nothing left but silence. She did not move when he dismounted. "You hurt?" Hayden asked, voice low. She blinked up at him, dazed. "No." "Where you headed?" She looked around the empty road, then back to him. "I do not know." Her voice shook, but there was something steady underneath. She was not weak, she was just left. Hayden glanced down the trail she had not taken, then at the broken trunk, then back at her. "Name's Hayden Lark," he said, offering his hand. "You want to ride with me a while, miss?" She stood slowly. "Wilhelmina Hart." He helped her onto his horse without asking questions she was not ready to answer. She settled behind him, arms around his waist, and he could feel her heart thudding against his back. They rode for a long time without speaking. By the time the sun dipped low behind the pines, they reached a small camp Hayden had made the night before. He dismounted, then helped her down gently, his hands careful and sure. She did not let go of him right away. "I can make coffee," she offered, quiet. "You do not have to." "I want to." He nodded and stepped aside. She moved like someone raised to hold herself upright no matter how hard the wind blew. As she worked near the fire, Hayden unsaddled the horse and set up her bedroll beside his. He kept glancing her way. She had the look of someone who used to laugh loud and often before the world taught her to be cautious. He had seen that look before. In the mirror, once the fire crackled steady, Wilhelmina sat beside it and wrapped her shawl tighter. "Thank you," she said, eyes on the flames. "I was supposed to marry a man named Silas. We were to meet in Helena, but when I arrived he was gone, left a note at the stage office. Said he changed his mind and left me with nothing." Hayden's jaw tightened. "You got family. My parents passed 2 winters ago. I have no one." He stared at the fire a long moment, then stood and walked to his saddlebags. From them he pulled a small bundle. Inside were the reins to his spare horse. He walked back and held them out to her. Wilhelmina looked up, confused. "This one is yours now," he said. "You ride with me until you figure what you want, or longer if you want." Her lips parted slightly. "You are giving me a horse," he nodded. "A horse and my word." She took the reins slowly, her fingers brushing his. "Why?" Hayden met her eyes. "Because you were left at a crossroads, and no woman should be left like that." Her lower lip trembled. She looked down at the reins, then back up at him. "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," but she did. She stood and stepped close, looking up at him with something careful in her eyes. "No one has ever done something like this for me," he swallowed. "Maybe they should have." They slept near the fire that night, not touching, but not far. She curled beneath his extra blanket. He sat up a while, watching the flames, his rifle across his knees. He had always been a quiet man. A loner. Not because he hated people, but because he had never found someone who made the silence feel less heavy, until now. By morning, Wilhelmina was already packing up the saddle bags. She moved with purpose, her veil gone, hair braided down her back. She looked over at him, smiled a little. "Where are we going?" she asked. He slung his rifle across his back. "South. There is a homestead near Clancy I've been thinking about claiming." She nodded once. "Then let us go." They rode side by side that day, her horse keeping pace with his. She asked him questions as they rode about cattle, rivers, winter storms. She listened when he answered, and when he fell quiet, she let him. That night they made camp again beneath a wide sky full of stars. She cooked beans over the fire, and he caught himself watching the way her mouth curved when she tasted them. She noticed. "What?" she asked, tilting her head. He shook his head. "Nothing?" "Hayden," he looked at her. "You smile when you cook. Like you are remembering something good." She softened. "My mother used to hum when she stirred the pot. I guess I picked it up." He smiled then, a quiet thing. They slept closer that night, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. By the third day, the trail narrowed into pine woods. A rustle up ahead startled the horses. Hayden drew his rifle fast, arm out to shield her, but it was not bandits. It was a boy, barefoot, filthy, no more than 6. He stumbled from behind a tree, tears streaked with dirt. Behind him, a girl even smaller clung to his sleeve. They looked starved. Hayden knelt down. "Where are your folks?" The boy shook his head. "Gone, we been waitin'. They never came back." Wilhelmina stepped forward, kneeling beside Hayden. "What are your names?" "Lyle," the boy said, voice shaking. "She is Liddy." Wilhelmina reached for them, slow and gentle. "You are safe now." They took the children with them. By the time they reached Clancy, Wilhelmina had braided Liddy's hair with a ribbon from her own dress. Lyle rode with Hayden, head resting against his chest. Hayden found the land he had been watching for years flat and rich, with a stream and a view of the mountains. He bought it that week. Wilhelmina stood beside him on the porch of the small cabin he built with his own hands. "You sure?" He asked her. She looked up at him. "I was left at a crossroads, and you handed me your horse and your heart. I am not letting either go." He pulled her close, arms around her waist. She leaned into him, sure and steady. "I never thought I would have this," he murmured. "You do now," she whispered, and when he kissed her, it was not rushed. It was slow, certain, like he meant to keep kissing her for the rest of his life, and he would. The early days on the land passed in quiet rhythm, fence posts driven into thawed soil, smoke curling from the chimney at dusk, Lyle trailing after Hayden with a hammer too big for his hand while Liddy carried kindling in her apron. Wilhelmina spent the mornings learning the terrain where the wild currants grew thick under the cottonwoods, how to spot a bull snake from a rattler, which section of the creek chilled deepest for the wash. Hayden had added a second room to the cabin, by then a modest space paneled in pine, its door carved by his own knife. He hadn't said what it was meant for, and Wilhelmina hadn't asked. Still, she lined its shelf with a braid of prairie sage and tucked her sewing basket beneath the window. One morning, Hayden came in with a split along his forearm, a line of red where barbed wire had caught him. He set the pliers down and sank into the chair without a word. Wilhelmina didn't fuss. She brought the basin, soaked the cloth until it steamed, and began to clean the wound with slow care. "You should have worn gloves," she said, voice hushed but steady. "I was trying to finish the south fence before the rain comes." She dabbed gently. "Then leave the north fence till after. That land's not going anywhere." He watched her, his brow furrowed more in thought than pain. "You always speak like you've lived here longer than me." "I listen better than most." His eyes softened. "You do." She wrapped his arm tightly, tied the linen off. When she looked up, his gaze was steady on hers. "I've been thinking," he said. Wilhelmina stilled, hands in her lap. "About the boy and girl," he continued. "About what it means taking them in." She nodded. "They need a home. They have one. What they don't have, what I haven't figured, is how to give them what they've lost." Wilhelmina folded the cloth, her fingers working slow. "You can't give them back their parents, but you can teach Lyle how to set a trap line and make sure Liddy doesn't go barefoot come frost." Hayden leaned forward. "And you?" "I can teach her to hem a skirt and sing a melody to hush her crying." His voice went quiet. "Then maybe we already are what they need." A breeze stirred through the open window, fluttering the edge of the curtain. She stood, smoothing her apron, and looked out toward the pasture where the horses grazed in loose clusters. "You ever think about how things begin?" she asked. He stepped beside her. "Not much, but I know when they matter." She turned to him, eyes searching. "What would you call this, you and me?" He looked down, the line of his jaw taut. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. "I'd call it real." She didn't pull away. That night, Lyle fell asleep with a carved wooden rabbit tucked against his chest. Hayden had whittled it from a scrap of ash. Liddy curled at Wilhelmina's side, her fingers wound in the hem of her sleeve. Later, when the children were tucked in behind the partition, Wilhelmina stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung low, wide, and yellow. Hayden stood beside the rail, arms crossed, listening to the night. "Do you ever miss being alone?" she asked quietly. He glanced at her. "I used to think I needed it. And now, I sleep easier hearing 4 breaths in the cabin instead of 1. She leaned beside him, shoulder against the post. "I never thought I'd end up here." He didn't answer right away. "Then, I never thought I'd want someone to stay." They stood like that for a long while, the only sound the wind moving through the grass. Inside, the fire dimmed. Outside, the stars pressed close like they were leaning in to listen, and when Hayden finally reached for her hand, he didn't let go. By late September, the first frost curled along the edges of the pasture grass, and the light shifted mornings thinner, evenings gold as old wheat. Hayden was up earliest, always, feeding oats to the horses before the sun cleared the ridge. Wilhelmina had taken to rising just after, sliding her arms into her shawl, checking on the root cellar, tying a bonnet over Liddy's tangled curls when the child wandered out barefoot. Hayden watched her from the corral one morning, elbows resting on the top rail. She was kneeling in the garden row, digging out the last of the carrots, her braid tucked into the collar of his old flannel shirt. Not the one she rode in on, but one she had claimed after a storm caught them weeks back. That day, she hadn't asked to keep it. Just wore it, and he hadn't asked for it back. Lyle trotted over with a slingshot slung through his belt. "Ma says I can help you mend the coop." Hayden raised an eyebrow. "She say that, or you ask, and she didn't say no," the boy grinned. "Same thing, ain't it?" Wilhelmina straightened, brushing soil from her knees. "If he splinters his hand, you're the one pulling it out." "Fair enough," Hayden said. He lifted Lyle to the roof while Wilhelmina gathered the carrots into her apron, humming under her breath. Not the tune she sang for Liddy, but something slower, full of long notes and memory. She didn't notice Hayden listening, not at first. "You hum when you're thinking," he said once they were alone again, the children chasing each other beyond the barn. She wiped her hands on her skirt. "I was trying to remember what it felt like to play piano. My fingers knew the weight of the keys better than most things. I haven't touched one since Kansas City." "What did you play?" "Nothing anyone know now, mostly hymnals, a few marches, some Schumann when my father wasn't in the room." He didn't think much of German composers. "You miss it." "I miss how it made me feel like the world listened back," he nodded slow. "Would you teach Liddy if there was ever a piano here?" She looked at him, startled by the question. "I'd teach her everything I know," she said. "If she wanted it." He rubbed his thumb against a nick in the fence post. "I'm thinking of building a frame addition come spring, one with space for a table big enough for 4 chairs. Maybe more. You plan ahead." "I do now." The last of the geese flew overhead 2 days later, and Wilhelmina brought in the squash. That night, Hayden found her on the porch stitching a hem by lantern light. He sat beside her and waited until she looked up. "I went into town today," he said. "Traded pelts for flour, brought back salt." She nodded, threading her needle again. "I also stopped by the courthouse." She paused, thread caught between her fingers. "I asked about taking guardianship of Lyle and Liddy. It's not official yet. Needs signatures, 2 witnesses. And you came back without telling me first." "I wanted to be sure I was doing it for the right reason." "And what reason is that?" He met her eyes. "Because they already look at you like they've been yours all along. And I don't want to be the man who borrowed something good without ever asking to keep it." She set the needle down. "You want to be their father. I want to be yours too, if you'll have me." Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. Wilhelmina Hart didn't cry easily, not even when she was left in white lace at a crossroads. "You're not a man of many words, are you?" she asked. "No." "Then I'll give you mine," she said. "Yes." He reached for her hand. She gave it steady, warm from the lantern glow. Inside, the cabin was dark, save for the embers in the hearth. Lyle mumbled in his sleep, and Liddy turned over beneath the quilt Wilhelmina had patched from old flour sacks. Hayden led her inside quietly, their fingers still laced. That night they didn't speak more. They didn't need to. In the morning, they would tell the children. They would ride into town with Lyle between them and Liddy bundled in Wilhelmina's shawl. They would sit before a clerk, and Hayden would sign his name in careful script, and Wilhelmina would press hers beside it, the ink a promise neither of them had to speak aloud. But for now they stood in the hush of the home they had made, while outside, frost silvered the window panes and the mountains held the last light of the day. The first snow came early, thin and dry, a dusting that turned the earth pale and quiet. Wilhelmina stood at the stove stirring cornmeal into a pot, careful with the heat so it wouldn't burn along the bottom. The window above the sink had fogged from the steam, and Liddy had drawn a crooked flower into the glass with her fingertip. Hayden came in from the barn, brushing snow from his shoulders. His coat was damp, his gloves stiff with cold, and he set them on the hearth to dry before lowering himself into the chair beside the fire. Wilhelmina handed him a mug without asking and sat opposite, tucking her feet beneath her skirt. "You were out longer than usual," she said. "The mare's limping. Back right. I'll have to walk her come morning, see where she's favoring." She nodded, then reached for the small tin she kept on the mantel. Inside it were scraps of paper and charcoal ends, and from it she pulled a folded page. "I started a list," she said. "Things we'll need if the winter's long." He took the page, eyes scanning the neat script: lamp oil, wool thread, vinegar, oats, sugar if there's coin to spare. At the bottom, in smaller hand, Lyle had added, "Soap that smells like pine." "We'll have to ride into Deer Lodge," Hayden said. "Clancy's dry of goods this late. Will we all go? I'd rather not leave you and the children, not with the snow coming. But I'll need help bringing back the sacks." She looked toward the loft, where Lyle had laid down early with a sore throat and refused supper. "If the boy feels well by morning, I'll ride with you," she said. "He can stay with Mrs. Evers. She's always glad for company." Hayden folded the list and tucked it into his coat. "You sure?" She gave a slow nod. "We've been quiet here too long. I wouldn't mind seeing other faces. Even if they're strangers." The next morning, Wilhelmina packed bread and dried apple slices into a cloth, tied it, and saddled the mule while Hayden hitched the wagon. Lyle sat bundled on the porch steps with a wool blanket around his shoulders, watching them through watery eyes. "You'll be back before dark?" he asked. "Before the sun even touches the ridge," Wilhelmina promised, tucking the blanket tighter around him. "Mrs. Evers will have you reading poems by the time I return. I like the cowboy stories better. I'll ask her to read one with horses then." He nodded, already drowsy, and leaned against the post. The road to Deer Lodge was quiet, the snow deepening in the shaded bends. Hayden drove while Wilhelmina sat close beside him, her gloved hands resting on her lap. They passed a group of Crow riders midway, wrapped in buffalo hides, heading northward with quiet nods exchanged but no words. Wilhelmina broke the silence after a while. "Did you ever think you'd settle near a town? I always figured I'd stay near the high country, but I never pictured what it'd look like with someone else beside me." She glanced at him. "And now I think about the shape of things, where the barn'll go if the cows come through in spring. How many rows we'll need for beans, what kind of bed Liddy'll grow into." She smiled faintly. "I think about how to teach her letters." They reached the town by noon. The general store smelled of dust, leather, and winter oranges. Hayden carried the flour sacks while Wilhelmina bartered for lamp oil and salt. She studied bolts of fabric with her fingers, choosing a dark blue wool that made her think of twilight over the pasture. She didn't say so aloud. Outside, she paused beside the church. The bell tower stood quiet, the steps covered in wind-blown snow. Hayden watched her hesitate. "You want to go in?" She shook her head. "I just wondered if it'd feel different now." He waited. "I used to think churches meant safety," she said. "Then I waited in one for 3 hours with a veil and no groom. That changed the way the air felt in places like this." Hayden stepped beside her. "You don't need a church to tell you what's sacred." She met his eyes. "I know that now." They rode home as the sun dipped low, their wagon heavier, their words quieter. Near the bend where the cottonwoods leaned over the creek, Hayden slowed the team and turned toward her. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Wilhelmina turned, one hand still resting on the folded wool in her lap. "There's land to the west of our cabin, flat enough for another structure near the lilac bush. What would you think of building a schoolhouse come spring?" She studied him. "You want me to teach the valley children? I want you to do what makes you feel full." She was quiet a long time, then said, "I'd need slates, chalk, a table wide enough for 6. I'll get them." She looked out across the snow-covered hills, then back at him. "You always did hand people what they needed before they could ask." He gave a quiet breath of laughter. "Only when I know they won't ask for themselves." By the time they returned, the sky had gone indigo and the windows of the cabin glowed warm through the dusk. Lyle and Liddy were asleep on the rug by the fire, Mrs. Evers knitting beside them with her boots off and a shawl around her shoulders. "They were angels," she said, standing slowly. Lyle coughed, Liddy sang, and I drank all your tea. Wilhelmina pressed a kiss to the top of Lyle's head and whispered thanks. Hayden lifted Liddy and carried her to bed. Later, when the children were tucked beneath quilts and the wind had picked up outside, Wilhelmina stood in the doorway of the second room, her hands resting on the frame. "You were right," she said. "It does feel like something worth keeping." Hayden came to stand behind her, his hands settling on her back. "We'll build it together," he said. "All of it." And she believed him, not because he promised, but because he always did what he said and never more than he meant. The thaw came slow that year. Snow lingered in the hollows through late March, clinging to fence posts and the north side of the cabin where the sun didn't reach. When the first bluebirds returned, Liddy was the one who spotted them. Her nose pressed against the window, whispering to herself as if afraid to scare them off. Wilhelmina had begun drawing up plans on brown paper measurements for the schoolhouse, lists of children in the valley whose parents might send them. She sat at the kitchen table with Hayden's measuring stick and a stub of charcoal, her hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled. Hayden came in from stacking wood and leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've got a look on your face," he said. She didn't glance up. "I'm trying to decide which way the windows should face. Morning light's gentler, it won't blind them when they're doing their sums." "You want help?" She finally looked at him. "You know how to square a frame. I know how to follow instructions." She folded the edge of the paper, a small smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Then you'll do just fine." The children were outside by then, Lyle chasing Liddy with a stick he'd whittled into a pretend sword. Their shrieks echoed off the trees, bright and sharp. Wilhelmina stood and stretched her arms over her head. "I want to tell them soon," she said. "About the wedding. They think we already are, their children. They believe in what they're given." Hayden stepped closer, brushing sawdust off his sleeves. "And what are we giving them? A family with no cracks in the seams," he nodded, quiet for a moment. "Then I've been carving a ring, from the cherry branch that split last fall. You've been holding out on me." I wanted to finish it before I asked. She raised an eyebrow. "You're asking now?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me in 2 weeks with the creek thawed and the lilacs blooming." "I'll marry you tomorrow if you bring me coffee first thing." He grinned, and this time she laughed, full and unguarded. 2 weeks later, the lilacs bloomed. Not in full force, not yet, but enough to scent the air sweet and earthy. They married under the cottonwoods by the creek, with Mrs. Evers officiating and a handful of neighbors standing in the grass with their hats in hand. Wilhelmina wore a dress she'd sewn from the blue wool, simple and fitted, and Liddy wove a crown of wild violets for her hair. Hayden wore his cleanest shirt and the same boots he'd worn the day they met. Afterward, they ate cornbread and dried apple pie by the fire pit, and Hayden passed around a bottle of blackberry cordial that made even the oldest rancher chuckle like a boy. Lyle sat on Hayden's shoulders half the afternoon, and Liddy fell asleep in Wilhelmina's lap before the sun touched the ridge. That night, after the children were tucked into their beds and the last of the lanterns had been turned down low, Wilhelmina stepped out onto the porch. Hayden followed, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Still think we'll need 6 chairs at that schoolhouse?" he asked. "Maybe more." He kissed the top of her head. "We've come a long way from that crossroads. I think I found the right trail." Spring thickened. The schoolhouse went up plank by plank, Hayden hammering while Wilhelmina painted the trim a soft brown. By June, the first bench was built, and Lyle had already claimed it for himself. Children came from as far as the ridge, their parents dropping them off with baskets of eggs and sacks of flour in lieu of coin. Wilhelmina taught them to read from the worn books she'd brought west in one small trunk, and taught them numbers by counting rows of seeds in the garden. Hayden spent his mornings fixing tack and his afternoons teaching Lyle how to follow deer tracks without snapping twigs. Liddy helped Wilhelmina gather herbs and pressed flowers between the pages of old hymns. They didn't speak of the past much. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer had weight. Everything that mattered was in the rhythm they'd built: the sound of boots on the porch, the smell of bread cooling on the sill, the way Hayden's hand always found hers in the quiet hours before dawn. One evening, as thunder rumbled far off and the sky blushed with the last light of day, Wilhelmina sat on the schoolhouse steps watching the children chase fireflies barefoot through the grass. Hayden came to sit beside her, a folded letter in his hand. "It's from the county," he said. "They're offering small funding if the school stays open through winter." Wilhelmina leaned against his shoulder. "Then we'll build a stove. I'll teach them by lamplight if I have to. I reckon we can." They sat there until the children tired, until the fireflies vanished, and the first drops of rain began to fall soft and slow. That night, in the warmth of their home, Hayden pulled the quilt higher over her shoulder. She turned toward him, drowsy and content. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered. "That I never knew a man could be this full." She kissed his jaw slow. "Neither did I." And they slept with the windows open, the rain drumming soft against the roof, wrapped in the kind of peace that only comes when the hard miles have all been walked, and there's nothing ahead but the life you've chosen and the hand you'll hold through all of it.